You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Abram Kibalevich, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Clear the aisles, the Projectionist has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Yitzchak Kolakowski, and tonight I think we're dedicating things to a very successful series of films that, unlike a lot of the other serial films that we've talked about on this forum, I think many of these, although there's aspects that are dated and make you wince, many of these still stand the test of time. And when they were produced, many of them produced by the 20th Century Fox and other studios, they were very big moneymakers. They were very popular. I don't know what the residuals were. I saw many of them when I was growing up. Talking about the Charlie Chan series, I think there's been 43 of them. I think so. It's 43 Charlie Chan films. And to talk about them in today's environment is almost, it's a tightrope act, because we know we're living in a time of intersectionality, of inclusivity. We're living in a period where Spielberg's West Side Story was applauded merely because of the fact that it used actual Latino characters or Puerto Rican characters, as opposed to the original Academy Award-winning version of West Side Story, which had, of course, Natalie Wood darkened up, George Chakiris darkened up, and this was considered a great affront to Latinx or Latino people. The fact that of people who were not the true color playing them. And this was likened to white actors playing black actors in blackface, which is probably the most horrendous thing anybody could do in today's society. You know, how could any white person smear black makeup on his face and walk around? And that's the most horrible, degrading thing that he's doing, no matter whatever that character is. Blackface, we know, is terrible. But it also turns into other types of faces, whether it's brown faces in the case of Latinos, and that is, of course, a reason to extol a new film, or whether it's Indians, and you've talked about it on this platform often, the fact that Apu needed to be revoiced because
away with the character altogether. They revoiced all the black characters, and they did away with Apu altogether.
Well, one second. You can still find Apu in the old Simpson episodes where
he hasn't appeared in 2 or 3 years in any new episodes. Yeah, and they didn't. I don't think they changed voices in the previous episodes.
Yeah. So in other words, it was tasteless to have the caricature of. Now, what about Dr. Hibbert? Dr. Hibbert is not a caricature because he's a good doctor and he happens to be very smart. He just has
they revoiced him. He has someone else. You know, I saw one cartoonist. He did a series of still cartoons about the Simpsons, and he said he had a whole thing about Lenny, and he said, I don't even recognize my best friend's voice, talking about Carl, who's black, and now there's a black person doing the voice of Carl, even though he's also Icelandic, and they don't have an Icelandic person.
Carl was part Icelandic and black? No.
He's a black person who was adopted by an Icelandic family.
I didn't know so much of Carl's backstory, but I think this is really part of what we've been talking about, is that, you need to have, in today's society, it is terrible to talk about a type of a film series and extol it as a series that's worth watching, when we know, other than a few of the entries that were actually played by Asian actors, most of the time the two great actors who played Chan, this incredible detective out of Honolulu, who was able consistently to outsmart all the other policemen that were on the case, was always able to find, amazingly, the killer in the very last couple of minutes, and the whole way sprinkle the program, which it really was almost like, most of them are about 60 minutes. Most of them are almost like, the length a little bit over of what we would call a typical hour television show. And he sprinkled it through with a lot of, basically made up Chinese wisdom. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the characters that did that were primarily Warner Oland, I think was a Swedish actor, and Sidney Toler. Neither of them, of course, were Oriental, who came from that part of the world. They weren't Asian, Oriental, and were made up in makeup. And it's been quite well known. Christopher Lee spoke about it recently in a film that I saw, where he talked about the efforts that were exerted in order to take a Caucasian actor and turn him into someone that was Oriental. We talked about a film a number of months ago, Yitzchak, and I recommended you to see it just as a curiosity, which is, I think, Majority of One, where Alec Guinness plays a Japanese fellow, right? And so it's really been something that Hollywood has done continuously, which is having what we call white actors with the type of prosthetics or makeup that allow them to appear as if they are actually Oriental. Now, I want to tell you something. One of the things that when I did some little bit of research on this, I discovered that there was the actual Chinese people who, though at the time, loved Charlie Chan. In fact, in Singapore and Hong Kong, when Sidney Toler visited there or Warner Oland made visits there, they were treated like royalty. People loved the films, and actually they did their own versions of it. But what I've heard, which is very interesting to me, was that in some of the films, they would have a Japanese person playing a Chinese character. And I have heard that this is a terrible affront to the Chinese, because, as you know, Japan for years dominated China in a way that was ruthless and considered, terrible. And the fact that the enemy of China should be played, a Japanese person should play a Chinese person, was a terrible affront. I've heard similar things, by the way, about there was a film, there was a series called Kim's Convenience, which was made by the CBC, where you had a Korean family, yet one of the actors who was playing a Korean family was actually Chinese. So, again, you could really split hairs on this. And again, I'm not trying to dismiss the ethnic differences, but you could really, it isn't so much about Christopher Lee or Sidney Toler or Karloff or anyone being put into makeup to look like an Oriental person. You could even take it a step further, that if someone is supposed to represent a certain country in a certain place, to have anyone who wasn't really from that place representing that country, you can take affront at that. And I think that's really, I guess that's the elephant that's in the room that we need to push out. I know both of us really scratch our heads over the great ire that has been that rises in people's consciousness over what's considered this terrible affront, what they consider bigoted and disgusting. We know, one of Louise Rainer, who won, and it was a Jewish German actress who won 2 Academy Awards, one year after the other, I believe, for The Great Ziegfeld and The Good Earth. She, in The Good Earth, which is Pearl S. Buck's book about the nobility of Chinese peasantry, and she played a Chinese actress. She played a part of a Chinese woman. And when she was interviewed, she lived to be 106 years old, Yitzchak. So maybe for some people, acting is a segula parichas yomim. I don't know what it was, but she was interviewed when she was well into her 90s, and she still comported herself in a very dignified manner. And she played, she won an Oscar for playing a Chinese peasant. And she talked about the fact that acting is always about something internal. It's always an illusion. It's always something that you're portraying. And the idea, I mean, look, are we going to tear our hair out over Olivier in The Boys from Brazil, playing Simon Wiesenthal character, right? Or you mentioned it earlier to me today in the remake of The Jazz Singer, right? Doesn't Olivier play Neil Diamond's father, I believe, right?
Which Warner Oland played in the original version.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, a full circle there also. So he did yellow face and he did Jew face also. I know.
Right, but we don't really see Jew face, and you can take a look in so many films. There's Amazon has Amazon Prime and Amazon, I don't know exactly who's producing it. They have a television series which many people have applauded, and it's about a Jewish family in late 1950s, early 1960s New York. It's called The Marvelous Miss Maisel. It's sort of loosely based on a version of Joan Rivers of a young Jewish housewife who becomes a star, or at least a very impressive stand-up comic. But that family, Rachel Brahanson, who's not Jewish, and Tony Shalhoub, who's Lebanese Christian, plays her father. And nobody's really saying, "Oh, look at these non-Jews that are playing Jews consistently. Oh, this is terrible."
Sarah Silverman is the only one who complains about it, but she seems to complain about a lot of things. So it doesn't surprise me. But
Look, we all know. Again, we all know it's fictional. Like what? Again, if somebody in a fat suit plays a fat person, I mean, again, it really gets to a point. I think both of us think that it gets to a point of inanity. Now, look, obviously, we are not as bigoted as we once were, and many of the films that we've highlighted have parts in it that we would wince from. There are even in the Chan films, many of the comic relief figures are very ugly caricatures of fools, and often black, sometimes Chinese. And definitely, I can see that somebody could take great offense to it. But when you have a character that's not played as a fool and is not played as someone stupid, but actually is the hero, especially Chan. I mean, Chan is the smartest person in every single film. In every single film, he is the smartest. He's also the most, in a way, unlike Columbo, who's full of so many ticks and so much weirdness. Chan is sort of like he'd be a type, he's a guy you'd like to go to Sheer. You'd like to go to him. You'd like for him to be your Rebbe sometimes. He has a personality. He has a sense of humor, and he's again, as the 43 films were made, he ended up getting a bigger and bigger family. So he's definitely an incredible family person. And sometimes they have a lot of fun with the fact that he wasn't practicing birth control like other Western persons. But it's really hard to look at Chan and say, isn't that a terrible representation of? I mean, the one
at the time, it was actually meant to be the positive representation. It was the foil for the Fu Manchu character, that you had this really super villain who not only was a character who was an Asian character, but it was part of the evil persona. It was as much as some of those movies are very entertaining, but nonetheless they not only it's not only that he's a villain who happens to be Asian, but there's a connection between his villainry and his Asian culture. Even though, and not only that, but it's not a very accurate one. It seems to paint at least the one movie that I saw, it's Boris Karloff, The Mask of Fu Manchu, which is a beautiful movie. It's real, but it's just the character is so horrific. Where he seems to play him as in the script, it seems to have him as being a mix between Hindu and Chinese, which doesn't really go together, and also specifically being very anti-Christian. That was and so that was the negative, and wrong and false stereotype that was just all around bad, as opposed to this was Charlie Chan was supposed to be this positive character.
I would say that you're right. It definitely was a counterpoint to Fu Manchu, but it's interesting that that they draw on a little bit of a similar aspect, which is that somehow the East is really the source for great, sometimes incredibly powerful and destructive things, but great things. In other words, the Far East, the Orient. We here in America, we're very taken in by the fact that the mysteries of the world still come somewhere from the ancient world, from the Oriental world, so to speak. And I think that Chan consistently, whether it's mentioning ancient Chinese proverb, the wisdom of Chan, and I've heard this as a criticism, is why does he have to be the smartest guy? Like that's also racism. to assume that because he's from China and because he somehow taps into that Chinese culture, that's racist to say that he should be able to extol this wisdom that can solve all these cases too.
I mean,
Sort of.
I remember learning in yeshiva, we had a history teacher who was a very accomplished author and apologist, a Jewish apologist. And some of the boys would sometimes say some things. Boys will be boys. They said some things were racist, and one boy said, the Chinese, they're very good people, and then the teacher said, well, except the one, or they're very smart, or this and that, and he said, well, except the ones who are not. And that was the answer, and that really opened my eyes. You're right. We can't stereotype people. We have to look at individuals. But nonetheless, it was it was a good lesson in school that I learned there.
Well, the author of the 6 or 7 or 8 novels that these 43 movies was based on was Earl Dare Biggers, who was not a person of Oriental descent or Chinese or any Asian descent. But I guess what
well,
he was
he based on
right,
an actual police officer. I think his name was Chang. I don't remember the last name, but
Changapane,
yeah.
right? Um, yes, and he's based him in Honolulu, which at that time had not yet become the United States. So there was something about the idea that there was a place in the world that was peopled by uh, Asian people, but what was becoming Americanized. And I don't know if this is in the Biggers novels, but in the films themselves, the dynamic, the family dynamic, I mentioned that they played it for laughs, but it was also, in a way, an indicator of how well the Asian Americans, the Chinese Americans, and and also the Japanese Americans, the Nisei, were actually integrating into the United States. They were all Jimmy, Tommy. They all knew, although they spoke Chinese, they also spoke English fluently, and many times they were very handsome actors and actresses playing those roles. So Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others bemoaned the fact in the 1960s and 70s when they talked about the underclass, they would point to the incredible integration of Asians into American society. And they tried to use the success of the Asian experiment as some sort of to tease out from it what are the elements there that could be a model for other immigrant communities and communities even that had been in the United States much longer. And I'm referring even to the African American community when Moynihan wrote, his survey of understanding of the underclass, and he talked about why is it that we there was such a greater success rate in terms of poverty, in terms of which of course, in terms of jail, in terms of illness, in terms of life expectancy, and of course, this is something that we see consistently displayed all the time. And again, this is a boogeyman that we can talk about this on this platform, but we know that this conversation, if it would happen in the woke culture, would be this would be considered censored. But again, Chan really displays a very positive model of how an immigrant culture can retain a good part of its significance, a good part of its midos. When Chan sits with his family, they eat with chopsticks. They have Chan. One of the aphorisms is that that the same way thought must enter brain silently, so food when comes into body, or something like that, which of course is like what Chazal say about Ein Masichem Besud. I forgot which Chan film it's from. I collected all those aphorisms before we started recording, but I don't have them here in front of me. But the point is that yes, this is an example, even of a model. Now, I do agree that Charlie, as brilliant as he is, not being able to sort of like talk like a regular Caucasian, or at least allow himself to use verbs and nouns properly, is a concession to this idea that he's still the other, still the foreigner. And I can hear how people, take umbrance at that, because he could still use a Chinese accent and yet speak English correctly, as opposed to somehow leaving out proper nouns or proper way to really extol and bring out the character as something unique. And it's interesting. There have been attempts to revive Chan. I don't think, again, he would never be able to be revived today. I don't think because of all the baggage that's connected.
There's no Charlie Chan medium that would go beyond our 40-year mark, our cutoff.
Right. I think the last attempt to do that, was, I think, Peter Ustinov, and I'm not sure if it was actually produced or not. I did see a couple of minutes, Yitzchak, of again, Peter Ustinov might be Jewish somewhere back there. I don't know, but I did see Ross Martin in a made-for-TV film that I thought would maybe become a series. Ross Martin, of course, I've talked about in the past year with our good friend Tom Shavilla. I talked with him. He was, of course, the sidekick, and much more than a sidekick in the great, great television series, The Wild Wild West, playing Artemis Gordon, Master of Disguises, and person with a very great sense of humor. Well, Ross Martin, who died from a heart attack, in a relatively young age of 50 something, I think, he starred in a film called The Return of Charlie Chan. And in this film, Martin, at least for the couple of minutes that I saw, Martin takes care not to speak in the sort of pigged-in English that we see Chan in the Sidney Toler, Warner Oland films. And he has a very, very with it American, Americanized family. He's already a grandfather, not just a father. And again, here we have a Jewish actor in yellow face, so to speak, and yellow eyes. So I think that had Chan been able to be brought back, I think that element of Chan's speech patterns would have been eliminated. But I think Chan is verboten, and because he's verboten, what I'm worried about for our listeners is that people are not going to go back and watch these films. They're going to assume that they're racist. They're going to assume it's part of something ugly and can only be shown in some sort of forum, or some sort of where we're trying to highlight racism in Hollywood. And I think that's really too bad. Even Yitzchak, the Criterion Channel, who actually recently, and this is really what got me interested in it, the Criterion Channel recently had a series about Chinese Americans and about how American films, including the very famous Susie Wong film, a Flower Drum Song, Diary of Susie Wong, Flower Drum Song with Nancy Kwan. And they have one entry of Chan in their collection, which is Charlie Chan and Charlie Chan in Honolulu, I think it's called, which of course is where he lives anyway. So it doesn't really, and it's really a very inferior version. I'm surprised because when I decided to look back at what's available on YouTube or into the public domain, there's a lot of, again, like all films of the time that didn't have incredible production value, you can always poke holes in it. But I really think the Chan films are worth going back to, and I think they can be quite enjoyable. And you could even get into it and try to figure out the mystery yourself. So we're going to talk about two films tonight. One film is something that's called, which I thought was really interesting. It has a connection to you too. It's something you'll find out in a minute. I'm going to surprise you. It's called Charlie Chan at the Opera. And the title card starts with Charlie Chan versus Boris Karloff. At that time in 36, Karloff was already a major star, with Frankenstein and other films. People knew what Karloff stood for. And, spoiler alert, you're supposed to somehow think that Karloff is, of course, the terrible villain and the terrible villain that you expect him to be. And it's interesting that the film starts right before anything. It starts. You can hear singing. Clearly, a baritone singer is reaching very interesting notes, and I don't know exactly what the words mean, but it's interesting that there is actually it's not exactly the Red Shoes, but there is an opera that is in the film, and there's at least 6 or 7 minutes of this opera, and it was written by Oscar Levant, who was a musician and an actor, a Jewish fellow, who I think I might have talked about here in the past. So Oscar Levant wrote this opera that was inserted in this film. Why is Chan at the opera? It seems like he's in San Francisco waiting to take the boat to Honolulu where he lives, I think. I guess there still is the San Francisco Opera House or something like that. But it's interesting that it starts with Rockland State, Rockland State Sanitarium or something like that. Now, Rockland State, does that ring a bell to you?
Yeah,
Rockland
yeah,
State?
that's right.
Okay, it starts. Karloff is the opera singer. Of course, he's lip
Well,
syncing.
he's in New York,
So he's in it's California, but again, this
right?
is one of the goofs. I don't know if anybody catches it. Rockland State. It starts with in Karloff is singing, and you have a couple of turnkeys who are at the sanitarium, and they're spooked by this fellow who just sings this incredible operatic way, and he is amnesia. He doesn't know who he is, and he just sits there and sings and sits at the piano. And when one of the orderlies enters into the piano room as he's sitting, Karloff is sitting at the piano singing. This has got Warner Olin playing Chan, by the way. So he's playing the piano, and I told you not to interrupt me. And he brings him a newspaper, and somehow the image on the newspaper has something on it, that the image of a certain soprano, a super opera superstar like a Maria Callas of her time, and somehow that jars his memory, and he does violence to. We don't know if he kills him or not, but he somehow escapes the sanitarium, putting on this guy's clothes, and he escapes. And of course, a number of newspaper headlines indicating that that insane criminal is on the loose, maniac on the loose from Rockland State, but somehow it ends up in California. I don't know exactly. So I don't know, Yitzchak. Maybe it's I don't know how he makes it across the country or not, but could be the screenwriters just got a little bit confused. I don't know, but
All the way across. He could,
I think so. I think Rockland State was supposed to be in California because anyway, it turns out, of course, that the plot of the film is that somehow his memory has been jogged, and he is on his way to wreak revenge on the people who left him to be burned and die, and he was somehow put in some sort of like he was this great opera singer that the world presumes is dead, but really he was the husband or at least if not the husband, he was somehow involved with this opera singer, and now they've decided, and he was the victim of being trapped in a burning building, and now he's going to find out where she is, and he's going to somehow wreak his revenge, and the way he's going to do it is by he's going to somehow he plays Mephisto in this fictionalized opera that Oscar Levant composed, and he can therefore he's in a type of mask where you're not really sure who he is, and he's going to take the place of the other baritone singer, and in that way he's going to be able to somehow wreak his revenge upon this woman who was tried to kill him and take him away from his daughter. Okay, so anyway, so you really think that somehow Karloff is, with his plot, he's going to, end up being the murderer, because it turns out, of course, that the woman who was that soprano ends up being choked in a room to death. And there's another death murder as well. Anyway, so Chan is somehow an opera fan himself, and along with his number one son, Ki Luke, who is somehow part of the troupe of this opera troupe, this operatic troupe, has a number of Chinese young people as part of their troupe. I'm not sure exactly why. And somehow, with number one son, Jimmy Chan, helping him, Charlie puts the clues together and tries to figure out exactly what's going on. Anyway, spoiler alert, it's not Karloff. But again, you're supposed to somehow think, oh, look, let's put Charlie Chan versus Karloff in his character. I think he plays a character called Gravel, which is interesting, Gravel. And, again, obviously in 60 minutes, when you're going to introduce the various suspects, they're all going to be paper thin as characters. It's going to be very difficult, and you're going to have this in whether it's Murder She Wrote or Diagnosis Murder, or Columbo, perhaps not, because they actually worked a lot because it's only in Columbo you know who the murderer is basically. So there was a lot of character development in those Columbo programs between it with the murderer, whether it was played by Leonard Nimoy or played by Theodore Bickel or others. I talked about this here on this forum. But when you have one of these programs where you have 20 different possible suspects or 6 possible suspects, and you only have an hour to do it, it's going to be very hard, except for a couple of perfunctory little scenes, to be able to determine who exactly is the murderer. Throw in the fact that in all these films, you have to have some comic relief with some sort of character, or Chan throwing in his wisdom. It's very hard to expect. You're not. It's not going to be a Streetcar Named Desire. You're not going to have great complex characters here at all. You know what you're getting. It's bubblegum, but it's bubblegum in a way that you actually can still, you don't wince, you can smile, you can actually appreciate it. This one specifically, which is available to anybody, Chan at the Opera, it also has it has in it, I think, a pretty decent surprise. It's not like all the fingerprints are there, but I want to really recommend it for another reason, because it's really anti-racist. There is a character played by William Demarest. You mentioned, by the way, Demarest was to get along with Warner Oland, was in the original Jazz Singer. So Demarest has been a character. I think he was even in silent films. I, of course, became aware of Demarest as Uncle Charlie in My Three Sons. But really, William Demarest, along with Walter Brennan, was a character actor that was played in hundreds of Hollywood films, always a sort of a starchy character. And here he plays the sergeant detective who is technically on the case, who is clearly racist. Keeps on calling Charlie Chan chop suey when he can't tell the Chinese apart. And he is the Archie Bunker character that is constantly getting it wrong. Anybody watching the film realizes that we're not laughing with him, we're laughing at him. He's the guy who has egg on his face, but he has it in a way that he still isn't a total caricature. So it really, I believe, Demarest, although he pretty much plays the same role almost in every movie he's in, I think he was perfectly cast. And I think a way to really deflect any people saying, oh, these Chinese are all the same, oh, these Chinese are pushy, oh, these guys aren't really as smart as we think they are. It's a plot device that I think is instructive. So you have Chan, you have his very well-adjusted American-like son, you have his wisdom, you have his way of figuring things out, and also, very interestingly, what Chan always does, and I think he realizes he might be wrong. He isn't necessarily this all-knowing Mandarin. There are sometimes he assumes something might be right, but he's willing to change his mind when something else happens. He doesn't dig his heels in. He pursues possibilities, but unlike many of us, we form first impressions and we're not willing to let go of them. Part of what in the Chan films, you can see that part of wisdom is holding back. There's also another thing here which comes up in the film, is humility, is that Charlie is a very humble person. He keeps on calling himself humble self, but he acts it with humility towards others. Even when he's smarter than them, he doesn't do it in a way that is that is condescending. Now, I don't know if the series always was able to achieve that in the 46 films, whatever it was, because sometimes when you have a know-it-all, he's going to come out condescending. But I don't think I think Warner Oland really played the character in a way that was soft, and you actually saw the midas of Anova, as we call in Hebrew. So I think that, like I said, I think it's the type of thing where, hell, you're not going to put it up on a pedestal as a great thing, but if you don't want to invest yourself emotionally to a point where you find yourself tearing up or have to sit there for hours, 60 minutes or 65 minutes, which I think is the average time of the Chan films, I think will reward you. Which now I know you also, based on you knew what my suggestion was, you went and screened another Chan film. What was that?
And that was the thing. I don't think I ever sat through a whole Charlie Chan film before. I know my Zeta Oliver Sholem, he was a big fan of the Chan movies. He would always, use the, he would say things like, to my uncle, "Oh, number one son," things like that. So it was something that was part of their, of their world. Even my Zeta was Sherman Ter Mitzvahs, but that was the world. And I wanted to say one thing I meant to mention when you were talking about this is I remember when I was a kid there was a reprint of a newspaper from, I believe it was VJ Day, and there was the whole newspaper was reprinted. Whether I think it was the New York Daily News or the Newsday, one or the other. And in this, they had a little, one frame comic. It was Confucius Say, and it showed Confucius looking the with a magnifying glass at a butterfly, and something about the wisdom of seeing beauty in the smallest things and things like that, and the appreciation that there was for Chinese culture, even though again today it would seem distasteful, but it really was in what was at the time would be respectful, and I think that's what you have all together in these movies. Now, it's interesting. The film you mentioned had Karloff in it, and the first talkie to feature Charlie Chan also had Karloff. Charlie Chan was a minor character in that movie. Was called, I think, it was uh, Behind That Veil or Behind That Curtain. I'm not sure what it was called, but Karloff was a bigger character than Chan, who there was actually played by uh, an Asian actor, a Korean American actor. Most of the early Charlie Chan movies were lost, and so the first Charlie talkie that was the Behind That Veil was the first talkie to feature Charlie Chan, but it was a minor role. He wasn't the star of the movie. The earliest starring movie that we have with Chan that is still around is called The Black Camel, and yours had Karloff, so mine has Lugosi, and this was from 1931, so it's 5 years earlier than the one that you mentioned, than Charlie Chan at the opera, and also it's definitely pre-code type of a movie, and it's very prominent the pre-code nature of the movie. It's a pretty I would say racy movie. Charlie Chan's name was not in the title of every movie, which would pretty much for I think the rest of the Warner Oland series until he passed away in 1938. All of the movies pretty much after this had Charlie Chan in the title of the movie, and so. But here we have it's called The Black Camel, and it's
I think it's one of the films that has actually can be tethered to the original source material that was written by Diggers. Right.
one of the books.
Right.
So
In other words, it was based on a book, so they really had a plot outline to base themselves on. As
yeah,
opposed,
yeah. As opposed to, go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah, as opposed to many of these other films where they had to sort of invent a lot of the characters and what was going on. It's always, again, screenwriters find it easy when they have something to pick the bones off of, as opposed to creating out of cloth. Um, and
I think in this movie you do have a bit more developed type of characters. It is a little bit longer than typical Chan movie. It's an hour and 15 minutes, so it's 15 minutes longer than a lot of these other movies. But nonetheless it's the characters. It takes place again as always in Honolulu, but it's actually filmed in Honolulu on location, and you have Bela Lugosi and also Dwight Frye, both of whom were in Dracula earlier that year. Now they're presented here with
so
as these
so
characters.
so what's the actual murder, the plot that Chan
So
needs to solve?
there's an actress. She seems to be very, very established and famous and popular actress, very glamorous woman, and she in the beginning of the movie, she's in the middle of filming a movie, and she it's pretty much all the gossip papers are saying that she's about to get engaged to this other this wealthy industrialist, something philanthropist, and there's something that she feels like she can't do it. She's not ready for that, and she has to talk to her fortune teller to pretty much get permission, almost like you would go to a rebbe and see, is this a good shidduch? Lahavdil, it seems like she has to talk to this character played by Lugosi, who she flies in or ships in from California, because she's filming on location in Honolulu, so she has to bring in this Tarnavero, this fortune teller who's going to gaze into his crystal ball and tell her whether or not this is a good shidduch. And so she's telling her boyfriend there,
teller Lugosi, Tanavero, he actually, sort of like flips the table on her and asks her about that murder of this film star 3 years earlier, right?
Right. That his name was Mayo, and Danny Mayo, and he brings it up, and she's very very upset when he brings up that name. It seems that she had some kind of relationship with him, and how to deal with that, and they're trying to figure out, well, who killed this Danny Mayo.
So they have to. So basically, it's a double mystery. You have to figure out somehow Danny Mayo's death is somehow tied to Sheila's death.
Yeah.
And and Chan,
he gets a visit while she's considering marrying this one man. She gets a visit from another old boyfriend. So she seems to get around a lot, and it was actually her ex-husband who was trying to get back together with her. And so she has a pretty active life. You could see, having been divorced already and seeking to be remarried, but also having been involved in this relationship. So all these relationships really play into her situation there.
And now, and since, of course, let's just explain, since it's happening in Honolulu, the prime detective for solving murders on the Honolulu police force, of course, is Chan himself. So,
and Lugosi all throughout is playing that he's helping Chan figure out this murder, which kind of places him as kind of the maybe the main suspect, somewhat. But he, again, the spoiler alert, he actually isn't, although he's connected to it. And there's a lot more. I don't want to spoil the whole movie, because it's actually quite surprising
who the murderer actually is.
Not only that, but all the connections that the Lugosi character also has all throughout.
And that Chan discovers, that Chan is able to discover. Right. There's a great aphorism in there as well. I think he says, when always when conscience wants to speak, telephone is out of order, which is one of Chan's great pieces of wisdom, which I think is quite true today. Like, whenever our Yetzer Tov wants to somehow push us towards something, somehow in connection, something steps up to break that connection and to allow our better parts to emerge. Of course, Chan himself, in solving the murder, probably again is tries to get not only the bottom of things, because he likes to solve cases, but actually there's a moral, he's a moral human being, and who
they present him again, like you said, with a big family. He does have an assistant who actually is played by an Asian actor, who is more of a caricature, and not really a negative character, but someone who's kind of bumbling comic relief and a stereotype, and that's probably what's more uncomfortable there. But in general, it's a very very realistic, again, pre-code. You do have that pre-code thing where it seems
the illicit sexual relations that's going on between everyone.
Someone has to be getting undressed, and not that they're totally undressed,
right.
But they're.
But that is
this one, the Black Camel. It certainly was very entertaining. It wasn't, because I know a lot of people are like, they get bored with the old movies. Even this is what I enjoy. If something's in color already, I'm like, I don't know if I could watch this, even if it's from the '50s and it's in color. Like I start to get uncomfortable. It's something soothing about the black and white movies, but this movie, although it does have some, I guess, some plotting scenes, but for the most part, the characters are, I think, much more well developed than a lot of the later movies in the series. Again, probably because it's based on the book as opposed to something that's more or less like a Yesh Ma'ayin.
Which is really the fate of many of the Sherlock Holmes films, whether it was Rathbone or Leslie Howard's brother that was in it. Many of those Sherlock Holmes films were also, they had to invent it out of cloth based on characters created by Arthur
Well,
Conan Doyle.
they started having the Rathbone movies, which I love, all of them.
Mhm.
They switched from it being a period piece to being contemporary World
That's
War II.
right. That's right. That was all again, but
Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, and they're fighting Nazis, and it's
I,
like,
I guess I guess we could sort of end today and sort of wondering, okay, does Holmes have to be played by a Brit? You know what I'm saying?
right.
We started today talking about about intersectionality and people taking over
Well,
identities. Again,
I don't know if I could mention this or not, but I was.
I mean, Brits are constantly playing. Brits consistently are able, as we've seen with so many, Vivian Leigh and other actresses have been able to master the American accent perfectly. For some reason, we can't. It doesn't work
Peter
the other way
Sellers.
around. Hmm?
Yeah,
Peter
Peter Sellers.
Peter Sellers could do it. By the way, I do want to say one thing when we talk about Chan. I think Sellers did one of the best Chans in the movie Murder by Death. I think he plays Sidney Wang,
Yeah.
and he has a number one son with him as well. Again, the rest of the film is really, in a way, it's got Truman Capote in it. It really is, in many ways, a very disjointed film that is really worse than the sum of its than actually than the sum of its than all its parts. But there are parts of the film of Murder by Death which has pastiches of Nick and Nora Charles, David Niven in one of his last film roles, I think. Um, but if you could see the Peter Sellers part, Peter Sellers playing Chan version, it's great. It's great comedy. Plus, once again, Sellers Sellers' knowledge of how to do the accent, of how to bring out all the aspects of the Chan film. Again, it's really great. Ross Martin is a wonderful character actor, but nothing compared to Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers, we talked about him in Strangelove. Peter Sellers was a once in a century type of mimic and comedian. He was somebody really, really, incredible. Like really an incredible person. So again, he died much too soon, but he definitely left a great legacy. But this one little element, which I don't think people are that familiar with, it's worth to see his take on of its um, of its rejection of and allowing the Chinese who came here in droves of numbers, especially to California, the way they were put to work, the way they were prejudiced against, the way that they were in many ways segregated. But clearly, the 20th century and Chan, especially as who was created sort of in the beginning of the 20th century, really represents the emergence and the success of again of this country that we somehow see as which again the biggest country in the world in terms of population, but they're immigrants who have come to the United States who have enriched our culture in so many ways, in ways that it's become a part and parcel of the tapestry of what it means to be an American. And I think Chan, in many ways, is part of that. Look, we all know, especially where do we go on Christmas, right? You go to a Chinese restaurant because those are the only ones that are open. And even though the whole idea of egg rolls and all these things and fortune cookies are all American inventions, but in a way, not all of them are meant to denigrate. Yes, it's definitely seeing through a lens imperfectly, but I think the same way you have the kosher delis and people who are going for the babka and the bagels and the bialys, and which are maybe none of them are essentially Jewish foods. But I think we have to realize, and we have to stop being so sensitive about these things. We have to realize that that Chan and other elements of that really represent the success and wonder of what this country is. Yes, they actually do come from a country that had its Fu Manchus, had its emperors that were extremely brutal and dominated to the point, and the Japanese are right, the Chinese are right in terms of the atrocities that went on both sides. But here in the United States, in this incredible country, peoples from all over, from all these lands, have been able to come and contribute and become great role models, and are in a way that's really beyond integration. And I think we should see the Chan films as a step that was really towards that incredible absorption and embracing of that culture, a culture that as we say, we can always look back and say, look how far we have to go. There's still this inherent sense of the other, but in the 1930s, at least, before World War II changed many people, it seemed like America was a very accepting place, a place that embraced.
And that's the not only the melting pot, but also the tapestry, the
quilt,
beauty, the beauty in the.
再见.
再见.
Okay, let me see if I can get it.
再见.
再见. Is that goodbye?
再见. 再见.
再见.
再见.
再见.
再见.
再见, it sounds like, no?
再见.
So we'll see you hopefully again next week. So I'll say in Mandarin Chinese, 再见. We'll tell you, take care, everybody. Watch yourself step on the way out. We'll see you next week. Be well.
Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.